Thanks so much. And then we'll just get started with just the intro questions. So, Emily, thanks again for joining us. And I would love for you to just give us a little bit of who you are and your background, just really quickly, so that the audience can get a little intro of yourself.
Yeah, I'll sum up 32 years right quick. But yeah, my name is Emily Joy Allison. I wrote the book Church 2, but I also have a background in doing communications of various kinds. I was born into a context where my dad was a Southern Baptist youth minister, but then I was raised in a variety of evangelical church denominations over the course of my childhood and young adulthood. Went to Moody Bible Institute for undergrad, which was a trip and an experience. And then kind of took about 10, I guess 8 years off of that once I graduated, and just kind of like lived my life and became a person, and got married and got divorced, and just did things in my 20s, and then went back to seminary in the pandemic in 2020. So I do have a master's degree in theology. My concentration is in religion, gender, and sexuality. And my undergraduate degree is also in theology. So two theology degrees, but the first one's from Moody. So I'm not sure how particularly useful it is, but I think it does give me insight into like how the proverbial sausage is made, which I feel like has been really helpful to me as I've, kind of been writing about what we now call deconstructing. But, when when Emily and I were on the internet 10, 12 years ago, we didn't call it that then. But what's become popularly known as like deconstructing, I think my educational background has been helpful for that. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I have a wife. I have two very poorly behaved dogs and a cat. And I've lived here for about a little over 9 years and some change. And I currently work at a political action committee, which I really enjoy doing. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks so much. I actually didn't know that you went back to a seminary in 2020. What made you want to do that after all these years?
When I first graduated Moody, I wanted to go to seminary, but I just had this like feeling in my gut that I just like needed to like live life a little bit longer. I feel like I felt like I was educated beyond my maturity level, basically. So I was like, I need to like go be a person for a little bit. And then it was really, to be honest, like I had thought about going back to school for a really long time. And in Nashville, we have Vanderbilt University, which is where I went to Vanderbilt Divinity School, which has like the Carpenter program, which is like the premier program on religion, gender, and sexuality in the country. Like there's not another program like it at a seminary anywhere. So for years I was thinking like, should I, I lived here for years. I was like, should I apply to Vanderbilt? Like I probably should. And then to be the honest truth with you, what happened is I turned 29. And I was like, shit, I'm turning 29. I am not doing it. What am I doing with my life? I need to go back to grad school. And that's what the impulse was. I turned 29 and I was like, I gotta do something with my life. So that was, then I applied and I got in and it was nice. So I started that in August of 2020. So for the first year we were virtual, and then the second year we were in person, but that's kind of what I spent my like pandemic time doing, was finishing up my book and then getting my master's degree.
Wow, that's amazing. You mentioned that you currently work at a political action committee. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I work for Emily's List, which is a political action committee that works to elect Democratic pro-choice women up and down the ballot all across the country, federally, state and local, right down to comptrollers and stuff, all kinds of elected office, which I find really fun. I think before I went into theology, I took a political science class. Before I went to Moody, I was at community college for a couple of years. And I took a political science class and just completely loved it, like fell in love with it. I was like, this is so cool. My intention was to be a political journalist. And then I found theology, and politics and theology kind of scratch the same itch for me, because it's like fundamentally a question about A, rhetoric, and B, ethics. And those are kind of like my two favorite things. So for me, I see like working in politics as a natural extension of my theological education, especially given that like I don't really think that you can properly understand what's going on in our American political context right now without having religious literacy. It's deeply, what's happening is deeply tied to religion, right? And so for me, it's a natural extension of that. And I use my theology degree at work every day.
Oh, that is so interesting. Well, I would love to like ask you more about those two things, but I wanted to kind of like tie it back to the hashtag Church2 book, which you wrote and we thoroughly enjoyed discussing. And so, yeah, let's get right into it. I know that both Emily M, Julia, and Gabe, who are here, were part of the book club, and I wanted to ask them if they had any questions that they had before I went to my questions. All right, I'll give you guys more chances to ask. Emily, did you?
I was like, am I going first?
Go, Gabe. My questions. I'll ask
Go,
you
Gabe.
later.
You can go ahead, Emily. Emily, you can go ahead.
I guess I was gonna ask about the reception to the book a little bit. Like you sort of wrote the book because of becoming public with your story about experiencing, spiritual and sexual abuse by a pastor. And then what was it like? Like, was the hashtag going viral first, or was like the book aftermath worse as far as like how you managed it?
Hashtag went viral first. And to be honest with you, like I didn't start the hashtag or like tell my story with the intent of like, I'm going to start this hashtag and then I'm going to pivot into a book. Like that was, and then, I had, we were Twitter mutuals since like 2011. I've been on the internet for a long time, writing about a lot of this stuff, like thinking through a lot of this stuff publicly. And I had people at various times be like, you should write a book, you should write a book. But like, I don't want to write a book unless I have 60,000 words to say about something. And I don't certainly want to write a memoir, because I don't think anybody at my age should be writing a memoir unless they are like Malala, maybe, right? Okay, like Malala can write a memoir, but like generally speaking, nobody my age needs to be writing a memoir. So I was like, I'm not gonna write a memoir. I don't want to write a book until I have 60,000 words to say about something. So I told my story, I told my story without the intention of starting a hashtag. That was not the point. The point was I was telling my story. Then the hashtag was like an immediate part of telling that story. And then that went viral, but the hashtag went viral in November of 2017. And I didn't sign a book contract until September of 2019. So it was almost 2 years in between when the hashtag started. And I think what actually happened is in 2019, things were developing. The hashtag has always been so just rife with it never stops. It's just rife with all these stories. Today, yesterday, always, every day, it's rife with stories. And I think as more and more people were starting to pay attention to it, like at first when the hashtag started, like Christian media didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because it had a queer genesis, basically. And so they were always, all these articles being written, and it was like evangelicalism's Me Too moment. And I'm like, yeah, but you're not saying Church2 because of like who it's tied to. I know this. But as time went on, I started to realize that I had a lot of thoughts and feelings about how the conversations were being framed. And I realized that if I didn't write the book, somebody else was going to. And they would co-opt my work, and they would not frame it the way that I want to frame it, which is about the radical deconstruction of purity culture, right? So much of the conversation around Church2 is like how, like reforms we can do practically to stop, which is great. I love the reforms. Don't get me wrong. Love the reforms. But like, we're dealing with this like systemic base level, like when you talk about radical means to like grasp things at the roots, we're talking about this root level issue. And I was like, if I don't write this book, somebody else is going to write it. They're going to co-opt my work. They're not going to frame it how I want to frame it. And I was like, now I got to do it. So I started shopping it around in 2019 and started writing the book in September of 2019.
I can jump in. Hi. Sorry I joined late. I was on the other Zoom, but I'm Julia. It's so great to meet you, Emily. Your book is so incredible, and it's been interesting going through this as a like newbie deconstructor. How I started here was through purity culture, so it was cool seeing that like the whole picture really, and like how it was portrayed through your eyes and through your hashtag. A question I have is, selfishly, do you feel like and I know you talked about reconstruction at the end of the book, but do you feel like you'll always be on your journey, like always learning, like always like kind of like not like 100% sure of everything, like, or do you feel confident where you are now, and those thoughts don't really come up for you anymore?
Yeah. It's a funny question. So people in my life who know me intimately, lovingly like to roast me about how I always think that I'm right. But in my mind, the way that I think about this is like, of course I think I'm right. If I thought that I was wrong, I would change my mind. And I do regularly change my mind when I find out I'm wrong about things. Like, I think we always think we're right in the moment. And then you get more information. You just learn new stuff and you find out more. And then you change your mind. And then you think that you're right. And then you find out more information. And so then you're like, oh, I was wrong. I would say it's a little bit of both, right? Like, I feel confident where I am because I have done a lot of work to like get the information that I have, but I'm also always open to being proved that I'm wrong or being shown new information. And so I feel like that's kind of how I've handled this journey of like, like I'm a sort of a confident person by nature. I mean, yeah, I think I'm right, but I'm always open to like getting new information, to finding out I'm not right. I'm always open to evolving and to growing. And so I think, I don't know, like there's so much, this is a whole other like separate conversation outside of like church too and the book and all that kind of stuff, but just about like deconstruction movements generally speaking. There's so many conversations we could get into about like how useful it is it to like define ourselves antithetically, right, by this thing that we're not doing. Same with like exvangelical, right? Even though I would identify as exvangelical, but like how useful I have questions about how useful it is to like define ourselves antithetically by what we're not. And does this deconstruction, it almost kind of parallels this like and maybe you have thoughts about this, Emily, as a therapist, but like it kind of parallels this conversation that happens around healing sometimes, where it feels like you're going to be healing forever and ever and ever and ever, and like you never get to like a place of peace, And I would say I have gotten to a place of peace. Like I have gotten to a place where like the questions that I struggled with 10 years ago do not keep me up at night anymore. I'm not like haunted by them when I'm trying to like enjoy my life. But I still try to stay like really consistently open to getting new information nonetheless.
Love that. Thank you.
So I guess I'll go next. Hi, Emily. I'm Gabe. This is actually the second time I've read your book during this book. I've really enjoyed it as a male survivor of purity culture. I found it really insightful, and I was also kind of late, and also I had the screen off because I was eating, and I don't think anybody wants to see me eating. But I've been trying to like kind of come up with a really good question, because I mean, I know that purity culture, I know that women are much more statistically affected by purity culture than men are, but as like for any like male survivors of purity culture, or for like, say, maybe like male church leaders who might, who somehow might read this book? Uh what's is there anything that you hope that they would get out of it? If anything at all, if somehow they read, come across your
Like
book.
male church leaders. Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, I am aware that church leaders will read this book, but I didn't write it for them. Right? Like, it's sort of like Beyonce's Lemonade. Like, as a white person, I'm a guest watching Beyonce's Lemonade, and that I feel the same about like the church leaders, right? Like, the clergy are a guest to this conversation, because in my mind, I want to center survivors. I don't think there's a useful conversation that happens around this that centers churches or clergy, or people in ministry, because those are the people who have perpetrated this. And not those, I mean, I don't mean those specific people, right? A lot of them have not perpetrated anything, but as a rule, right, I'm centering survivors in this conversation. So, I mean, I would hope that they would take a page out of that book and learn more to center survivors in their conversations, because so many of the conversations that happen in churches are more about like reducing liability, than they are about actually helping people heal and get justice, whatever that looks like to them. Right. So, I mean, on the clergy front, I'm like, y'all are guests here. I didn't write this book for you. I know you're going to read it, but I didn't write it for you. I wrote it for survivors. I wrote it for me, frankly, 15 years ago. 20 years ago. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's who I was trying to think about my younger self and like what I would have needed to be told and the framework that I would have needed. So there's that on that front. I also I strongly feel that like purity culture deeply harms men. Like, it super duper does. And sometimes I think, it's a different sort of harm, usually, at least insofar as like, we're talking about like cis men and cis straight men. It's a different kind of harm, but it's a deep harm. And so I think that's something that's important to not be downplayed. I think I talk a little bit in the book about how we are actively discipling men in the church to think that really unhealthy, toxic, abusive things are normal and godly and holy. And I think that's one of the ways that purity culture deeply harms men. So I think that's a conversation that super duper needs to be had. I will say, generally speaking, like, I didn't write a book about, I included the stories of men in my book. And I was glad that I was able to include the stories of, one man who identified as gay and one man who identified as straight, to kind of like get a contrast there for how they worked through what happened to them. And I love Kenny. He's a friend of mine, but, generally speaking, men are sort of underrepresented in victims of sexual violence. And unless you think of situations kind of like there was a lot of male victims in like the Catholic Church, or especially like the Boy Scouts, like that was pretty much all men. But generally speaking, in the context that I'm talking about, men are sort of underrepresented in that. And so I think it's important to touch on that, especially because so like the vast majority of perpetrators are men. So then when you have victims who are men, there's this added layer of like fear of homosexuality and like fear of LGBTQ stuff that gets then tossed on top of that. That's not necessarily a factor when the perpetrator is male and the victim is female. So there's a lot of layers there, right? And I think those are important conversations to have and to continue having.
Well, that was great. Thank you.
Those are great questions. Did you guys have any other questions?
Is there anything in the book that, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go Emily. I was gonna just throw something out there and hope it stick.
Do it. I want to hear it.
Put myself on mute. Oh my God, I forgot it. Sorry, go Emily, go.
I'm curious if you feel like like, is there anything in the book that you feel like you didn't get to dive into enough? that you like wish you could have included, or like that you've still been thinking about, like, oh, I did all this research on this and I just couldn't fit it in? Like, is there anything that you left out that, or that you'd want to talk more about?
I mean, like an untold number of things. Like it was my editor named Lisa, who I love, who I would die for, like redlined the shit out of my manuscript, like cut so much stuff that I wanted to include, because I'm like a huge nerd, right? Like I'm a big information dork. I just want to like, I've got files on files on files of like everything that I'm studying, everything that I'm interested in. And there were so many things I wish I could have included. Like, yeah, I think there's so much more to be said about the connection between abortion and purity culture. Another thing I really wish I would have had time, and I kind of have like a little bit of like a second book proposal fleshed out for this question. I don't know if anybody's going to take it, but I have fleshed it out a little bit. So I wrote my master's thesis on like human trafficking moral panics, and the way that like the Christian right like overinflates numbers of sex trafficking, and the way that interacts with purity culture. And I wish I, like, especially because my book came out, the January 6th insurrection happened on January 6th, 2021. And then my book came out in March of 2021. And like all the stuff with like QAnon using like child sex trafficking and like save the children type language, all these like moral panics that QAnon was fomenting in order to do like political power. I think there's so much parallel with that, with the way that purity culture shows up in our politics. Like I would have loved to be able to dive deeper into that. I mean, it's just the domestic violence stuff. I had pages and pages more that I could have included. It was like pulling teeth to try to get it to the length that it currently is.
Is purity culture a moral panic? Or is like QAnon, I forget exactly the definition of a moral panic. Or is like QAnon, or like the inflation of numbers around sex trafficking, like a moral panic? Is purity culture itself one?
I don't think purity culture is a moral panic, but I think it undergirds the logic and reasoning of a lot of moral panics, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about it, like right now we're having a current very severe and critical, I told y'all I'm in Nashville, not a fun week here in Nashville. We are having a very current and severe moral panic around transgender issues in this country. And so much of that has to do with this very Christian commitment on the part of a lot of legislatures that there are two genders, male and female. They're supposed to be heterosexually monogamously married to each other. And also to produce babies, right? I just retweeted this absolutely genius article today from New York Magazine. If you go to my Twitter profile, you can go read it. But it was about how the anti-abortion movement and the anti-transgender movement are using the same logic and the same tactics to do what they're doing. And one of the things it was saying was how if you look into like conversations about anti-trans stuff, eventually you're going to find a lot of people talking about like young, quote unquote, like young girls sterilizing themselves. And the implication there is that they should be having babies, right? If your fear is of young girls not being able to have babies, the implication is that you want them to be having babies, which is a purity culture thing, right? So I don't think purity culture would like properly be defined as a moral panic, but I think it undergirds the logic of a lot of moral panics that we have. And it's a vast well of resources for people who are interested in fomenting moral panics to draw from in order to motivate the people that they're trying to motivate, if that makes sense. I feel a little bit talking about that, like that meme with the guy and he's got all of his papers up on the wall and all the red string attaching the papers. And I'm like, this, but it really is, I mean, in my brain, it's all spaghetti, it's all connected. And I try to do my best to like make that clear for people.
Speaking of things that you wish you'd covered in your book, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember that you went into that much detail about what the Bible says about purity culture or about homosexuality or about or I don't know, gender roles, and
Mhm.
I don't know if that was really your aim, but do you was that something you would have touched on more if you had the time and space to do so?
This is like literally one of my favorite questions. And the answer is no, that was a choice. Um, and the reason I made that choice, there's a few different reasons I made that choice. One is personal. I'm a lesbian, and at this point in my self-esteem journey, I don't spend time justifying my existence or my marriage. I love myself. So I don't spend time doing that. The second reason is because I think to engage in that conversation, I think concedes too much at the outset. So, for example, like a debate that we could have right now is like, how do we tax a city appropriately in order to fund public transit? Right, that's a debate that we could have of like, okay, there's probably good people on both sides of this question about what the appropriate way is to like whether LGBTQ people like should exist or can exist or should have civil rights or are sinning or to go into hell is not in the same category as that, right? So I think when we engage in this question of like, I'm going to go tit for tat on somebody about the Bible with this, we're sort of agreeing to their premise that like this is something that we can settle like based on the Bible, right? And I think that kind of leads me to like my third and sort of more broad answer is just that like and which is not even necessarily about sexuality. It's more about like hermeneutics and how we interact with texts and specifically the Bible overall, which is that I think it sort of mangles the Bible and like sort of misuses the Bible to come to it as a resource for proof texting so that we can justify whoever we want to sleep with or whatever sexual choice we want to make, right? Or really, I mean, take it out of sex, really any choice, right? Some people engage with the Bible like that, like they're looking for a verse and a chapter to like justify every single life choice that they make. And I think that that is a really sort of like piss poor way of engaging with such an interesting text. And such a useful text and such a beautiful text. And I mean, not everything about the Bible is beautiful, but there's a lot of really beautiful things about it. And a lot of really interesting things about it and a lot of really funny things about it. And I think coming to it in this sense of like, in order for me to feel justified in my sexuality, I need to find a chapter and a verse in the Bible that says it's okay. Like I want to kind of break open, not just purity culture, but like hermeneutics, like how we engage with the Bible. Because talking about purity culture is really just part of a larger conversation about hermeneutics, because there's a lot of other things in the Bible that you could talk about. You know what I'm saying? Like just off the top of my head, like people, when antebellum slavery still existed, were constantly using the Bible to justify that, right? Like constantly using the Bible to justify oppression of racial minorities. And I think that's what happens when you come to the Bible trying to use it as a proof text. And the thing is, if you only, the thing that I don't like about that also is that we're not equipping people to have these conversations. Like if I were to do that, right? And you can do that. Here's what I'm saying. Like, I don't actually think the Bible is as homophobic as people think it is, right? Homosexuality as a word was not introduced into the Bible till the 1940s. It's not what archisenotoi means. Like we can go back and forth on the Greek, whatever. It's not as homophobic as people want to make it out to be. That being said, if all we are arming people with is like talking points on the Greek, like they are only going to be as smart as the last person that they talk to. And as soon as they have someone who gives them a more compelling argument about the Greek, then they're not going to, you know what I'm saying? Like I'm not trying to prepare people to be good arguers. I am trying to prepare people to be free. And so there, again, I'm a huge nerd. I have 2 degrees in theology. I love talking about archisenotoi. Like I love getting into the nitty gritty about the details. And I think it's very interesting. But for me, it doesn't strike me as a particularly useful way to talk about gender, to talk about sex, to talk about race. Because we really need to break open the way that we look at the Bible on those things. And that's not to say the Bible is useless or, bad. It's just to say that it's not that kind of book. Yeah.
That was a really good answer. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And-
Yeah. So all that to say is I chose not to do that in the book because I was not writing an apologetics textbook. And there are good, like for people, I put it in the now I was smart when I wrote that book, but I'm not anymore. In the appendix, I put it in the appendix, some of those resources, right? Because I was like, if you need to get into this with, like, for example, I just think of like, God, my wife works for the LGBTQ suicide lifeline and just is constantly getting, they constantly get calls about, gender queer and trans youth who are like stuck in these horribly abusive situations with like religious non-affirming parents. And, folks like that, I just have so much sympathy for. And I'm like, if knowing a little bit about the Greek would help your parents to be less abusive to you, I'm all about harm reduction, right? So I think it's good to have those resources. I'm glad other people have created those resources to talk about what the Bible says about homosexuality, all this kind of stuff. I'm glad those resources exist because I think they can be really useful for harm reduction. It's just not what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of got that sense that it was kind of like you chose not to engage with it because I feel like, I feel like people are they're just gonna stick by their guns anyway and not really budge, not really give that much of an inch over the issues that they stand on.
100%. And that's ultimately what it is, right? Because here's the thing. The Southern Baptist Church knows who I am, and they do not like me. And no amount of me talking about the Greek with them is going to make them think that I'm not going to hell. And so I'm not gonna waste my time on it, right? Like and the thing of it is, this is their whole goal, right? I don't mean just the SBC, but I mean, yes, the SBC and a bunch of other denominations that are very complicit in abuse. The whole point is to get us so exhausted arguing for our own humanity that we don't have time to organize, that we don't have time to protest, that we don't have time to like activate folks to make meaningful change, to help people get out, because we're still so stuck on this, like they want me to do apologetics about why I, as a lesbian, should be allowed to talk about church too. I'm not going to do that because I'm too busy trying to organize, right? Like that's what they want. They want us to be so exhausted that we can't organize. And so I'm trying to encourage folks to be like, step out of that game. Like, don't fall prey to it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a quote, living well is the best revenge. Yes. So I think that applies here. Like, yeah, you don't need to justify your existence. And it's kind of unrelated, but I always wonder if the Bible's ever been translated directly from the Hebrew instead of the Greek, or I don't know if the original Hebrew text has ever been found. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but yeah.
I have lots of Hebrew texts of the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament was written largely in Greek, partially in Aramaic. So they have lots of like pretty old manuscripts, of both. But yeah.
Cool. I really appreciated all your answers.
Thanks.
I got it.
Oh, great. Yes.
So my question is, what was the advice you needed to hear the most when you first started going through like dismantling purity culture personally that you didn't get when you first started?
Whoa. That's such a good question. Think about that for a second. That's a really good question. I think one thing that I really often make a joke about it's like one of the rules of marketing, right? Like who you repel is just as important as who you attract. And something for everybody is not a brand. But you know, I over the past 12 years, 15 years, have lost so much as a result of my changing faith journey and my evolving thoughts about sexuality and sexual ethics. You know, I have lost full church communities. I have lost contact with most of my biological family. I have lost professional opportunities. I have lost, you know, all kinds of things. And I think at the beginning of it, it really made me sad. At the beginning of it, I was like really hurt by it. And I think like what I see now looking back is like, I think what's scary about embarking on the journey of deconstruction, and especially of deconstruction of purity culture, is that there's this fear of like, what if I lose stuff if I do this? Like, what if and you will. And I think that's what I wish that somebody would have told me, like, you will. And in some ways that's sort of inevitable, unless you're extraordinarily lucky and probably extremely privileged. You will lose some stuff. Your mileage is probably going to vary on like what it is and how much, but you are going to lose things, and like it's going to be okay. Like eventually it will eventually it's not going to be like this thing that is like stabbing you in the heart and twisting the knife all the time. Like I don't know, I look back on the people and the things that I have lost from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I don't even want those things in my life now. Like now with my 2020, you know, backwards vision, I'm like, that would not have been good for me anyway. And those people were actually like kind of terrible people that I like don't want to be in community with. And at the time it sort of hurts, right? But I think that's probably what I would have said, that like, as Frederick Buechner says, this is the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen. Do not be afraid. Like you're going to lose stuff. Start coming to terms with that now, but like also do not be afraid, because we have a lot more strength in us than I think, and also therapy really helps. I've been in therapy for a lot of years, and that's also been extremely helpful to my journey of being able to manage all of this.
Thank you.
Oh yeah,
Question on
so good, Emily. Yeah, losing things does not mean you're doing it wrong. That is super important, because tends to be in evangelical Christian circles that like suffering is sort of glorified if you're a woman married to a man in evangelical circles, but generally speaking, suffering is sort of like you've done something wrong. In fact, that's kind of like the whole basis of purity culture, right? I think, you know, I don't think most of our parents who taught us purity culture were sitting around thinking like, I want my children to grow up emotionally stunted and vulnerable to predation. I don't actually think that was what was going on, right? I think what was actually happening is that they didn't want us to suffer. And they were sold this system that said, if you do these things, A, B, C, D, if you follow all the rules, if you keep it in your pants, if you, all these things, then you will have a happy marriage that has no baggage, and you won't, you know, you're not going to get pregnant and you're not going to get STIs, and you will never suffer. Nothing bad will happen to you if you do this. And that's the thing we need to unlearn, is this like psychological relationship to suffering, in knowing that like having your feelings hurt or your heart broken, it doesn't actually mean you did anything bad. It's not a sign that you were sinning. It's not, you know, we're all imperfect. We never navigate relational circumstances perfectly. You know, that's not to say you did everything 100% right. But losing things, as Emily said, it does not mean you're doing something wrong. Absolutely not.
So good. My question is, a lot of your book, I'd say 90% of your book, 9 out of the 10 chapters, is just describing all the harm that purity culture has caused, which is important. This is great information to see, like a 360 view of purity culture within the evangelical church and the effects. And then it just made us all sad. It made me sad reading all these chapters. And then there's this one chapter at the end about healing, and specifically like your journey in healing. I felt like one chapter was like not enough for the readers, because it's like we were so sad for 9 chapters, and it's like, oh, we get this tiny sliver of healing. My question is like, why did you decide to write your book like that?
Yeah. I think a couple reasons. You know, on the one hand, it's sort of like in order to get a book, this is some insider baseball in publishing, but like in order to get a book published, you sort of have to have like it, at least in this, you know, kind of market that I'm in, it sort of has to be a little actionable, right? So like it would be really depressing. Yeah, imagine how much more depressing it would be if I just had 10 chapters of all the bad stuff and then no healing chapter, which I'm sort of like a cynical person. So that's probably the book that I would have written on my own, you know, if left unsupervised. But my editor was like, you should probably, you know, do this. So yeah, it would have been more depressing if I hadn't had it at all. But I will say this, you know, like at the end of the third Lord of the Rings, when Frodo has been through all this shit and then he goes on the elf boat, and then you never find out what happens after that. I think that's kind of how I think of it. Is that like one of my biggest beefs with these conversations is when the healing process is made prescriptive. So like a really great example of this is all the people who are trying to like deal with church too and deal with abuse, but they're trying so desperately to just keep people in the fold. Like it was just people that hurt you. It wasn't Jesus. You know what I'm saying? Like it wasn't God. You like, there's churches who will accept you. Like, you know, don't give up on faith. And I'm like, it's actually healthier for some people to never darken the doors of a church again. It is actually healthier for some people to convert to Buddhism. It is, you know what I'm saying? Like there are so many different ways you can go with this. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to keep it kind of brief and open-ended was because I don't think the healing process, like healing is like something you can only experience and never prescribe, right? You can describe it. You can give your own experience of it, but you can't prescribe it for anybody else. And so I felt like, especially because I'm not a therapist, I felt like my most appropriate lane in that would be to just write a chapter on like, here's what's worked for me. Here's what's worked for people that I know and love. Like, here are some suggestions. Here are some resources I can point you to. If you want to learn more about this or that, like healing modality, here's some people that you can check out. But like, ultimately, like I can't do the work for people, right? Every single person, whether or not they read my book, has to go on that journey on their own and figure out what works for them. Because I don't ever want anybody to read what I did and think like, oh, I just have to copy what Emily did and then I'll be healed, right? Like it's so individual. It's not one size fits all. And so I think I probably could have done more with it, but I kind of wanted to just keep it brief and open-ended and also like understanding that like this really sucks. Like it does, the whole situation really sucks. And there's not an easy answer. And there's not a bow to put on the end of it. Like it really is like a terrible, horrible situation that we're currently in. And I want to point people towards hope individually, but I think one of the really hard parts, and, you know, this is something that I didn't really write about not because I don't think that it needs to happen, but because I just don't see a practical avenue of it happening, is that like the healing part is important, right? Each individual person going on their healing journey. But like ultimately, if we're just helping each individual person going on their journey, we're just playing whack-a-mole, right? We're just, whenever it pops up, we're dealing with it as it comes. But like, ultimately we want to do preventative work, right? We want to stop I want to see a generation of people who don't have so much purity culture to heal from. I want to see preventative work done on the back end so that stories like this, so that people don't have to spend years in therapy and doing all this stuff because they were abused by their pastor. You know, like I want to stop that from happening in the first place. And that is actually much harder and much more depressing, because the reality is there are things that you can do to prevent sexual violence in your church community. And the vast majority of churches are not willing to do those things. That's just true. I'm not saying none of them are, you know, certainly there are some, but most of them are not. Most of them are not, because it requires not only like a total dismantling of purity culture, but also a pretty radical like shift in how we think of like institutional power and authority, and like whose voices get centered and who gets to decide how things go, right? You know, even in very progressive churches and mainline denominations who are led by women, led by queer people, we still have this very like institutional like hierarchy of like who gets to be on stage, who gets to be in charge, who gets to make decisions. And as I wrote in the book, you know, there's been plenty of church too situations that have happened at progressive churches led by women and queer people. And so it's not a vaccine against sexual violence to have your church led by women and queer people, you know? And I think that's actually like the harder conversation is like individual healing. We can all take responsibility for our own lives, right? Like we can all take responsibility for our own individual healing. But that question of like collective healing and institutional healing is actually quite a lot more difficult. And really like, so people ask me all the time, like, what is your relationship with church? And do you think there are good churches? And I'm like, you know what? Like, again, it goes back to my harm reduction lens. I would like churches to overall be a net force for good in the world rather than a net force for harm. If you can't be a net force for good, I think those churches should die, right? I don't think the Southern Baptist Convention should exist. It's never going to. It's never going to be liberative for women or queer people or survivors of sexual violence. Never. Not even if they get that freaking database or whatever up and running. It's never going to be that, right? I don't think that means that all churches need to. You know, I think churches are vast wells of resources for organizing power, for financial power. Yeah, I see a lot of like good things in churches. But I have an overall sort of like pessimistic view of it. And I think that's hard to like, that's not like a very like nice thing to like wrap it up with. But I think that's a thing that we really need to reckon with truly, right? And I'll say this, like, so I worked at a political action committee for a year. I worked at a church for 3 years before that, while I was in grad school. And it was while I was getting divorced. I had a friend that worked at the church and they just like kind of got me a job there. And it was a soft place for me to land while I was getting divorced. And it kind of helped me work through some of my issues with like church. It was interesting for me to be like so critical of church, but working at a church. And that was a really rich site of personal growth for me to sort through some of my issues. But even ultimately, like I ended up leaving that church not because of like sexual abuse stuff, but just because of like power stuff. Just because of like kind of toxic power stuff. And, you know, so I would say I'm a little bit like disenchanted at this point. You know, I spend all my time talking about church stuff, talking to and with Christians about this stuff. Like I'm very passionate about it. I go to church on Christmas Eve and Easter. Or Christmas Eve and Ash Wednesday, really. We don't even go on Easter. But I really like Christmas carols, and my wife's favorite liturgical holiday is Ash Wednesday. So we do those too. But yeah, I don't know. And I have so many friends who are like clergy in progressive Christian spaces, and I like so respect them and love them and like think the work that they're doing is super duper important and absolutely critical and like needs to continue to happen. But I think that like that is where my work has value, is in sort of this like liminal space between like Christianity and atheism, of like being able to talk about this, but not being so in it that, you know, that I can't speak boldly to it. And so that's kind of where I find myself these days. I do nothing with my time but think and write about all of this stuff. But my personal, you know, piety and religious commitment has waxed and waned over the years, more waned as of recently. But I still find all of these things very important to talk about, so I still keep talking about them.
Thank you for that. That actually answered a lot of my other questions as well. And I think it's a great place to, oh, Julia, do you want to ask one last question before we close?
I mean, I did, but I don't know if it opens up a can of worms or it's a very simple answer. So, so anyways, I guess I'll just say it. So this might be a dumb question, but how did you personally get over the fear of the or else that you mentioned in your book, like, and in my case, the hell aspect from purity culture? Because just continuing, like, did you just continue to research and eventually you got there and had this aha moment? And people say change your mindset. I don't know how to, like, how do you just change your mindset when it's like literally in your body?
Yeah. So I'll say this. I think I'm kind of a weirdo. I do have an answer for this, but I think my answer is not particularly normative for how most people go through this. Hell was like actually the first thing that I ditched. And I think that's really helpful. I actually would prefer people to start with hell than sex, because I don't think that you can do good moral reasoning with a metaphorical gun to your head. So like, if there's this fear of hell, then how the hell are you supposed to ask these questions and like think through different answers to them when you're fearing like, oh my God, if I come to the wrong one, I'm going to hell, right? So hell was actually the first thing that I ditched. What I struggled with for a long time in the or else was more like practical stuff. Like I was so worried that I was gonna like get pregnant out of wedlock. What is it in the Mean Girls where he's like, don't have sex. If you do, you will get pregnant and die. Like that was more what I was, that was the or else that like kind of haunted me for a while. But the hell thing was something that I ditched early. And I would encourage most people to like start with that. Because if you're asking yourself questions like, is it okay for me to have sex before marriage? Is it okay for me to never get married? Is it okay for me to be gay? Is it whatever, any of these questions that we might be asking ourselves as we're sort of like starting to unlearn purity culture. If you're fearful that you will go to hell if you get the wrong answer, it's really hard to think through those questions thoughtfully, think through those questions with the care that they deserve, think through those questions in community. It's really, really difficult. And because of that, I recognize and have I feel so much like protectiveness over like people who are asking those questions, because it really is like when you're fearful that you're going to be punished forever for coming to the wrong decision, it's so freaking hard to like think through these things logically and emotionally and spiritually. So yeah, I would say that like that's my non-normative experience. I don't think most people do it that way, but I think like if people are really, really struggling with like unlearning purity culture, I would say like take a step back and like look at the hell stuff. Because that might be so I teach yoga. And a lot of people want to do like what they see on Instagram, right? All these like headstands and handstands and like fancy whatever. Sometimes what you need to do, like you can practice those things all you want, but sometimes what you need to do in order to nail like a headstand is you just need to stop trying for 6 months and do crunches, right? Because it's about ab strength. It's not about like, oh, can I get up on my head and hands? It's like you literally just need to develop the core strength to be able to do it. And it's a little bit like that, I think, in this, right? Like sometimes if you need to step back for a little while and do crunches, think about hell. That might actually help you to be able to nail the handstand proverbially a little bit later, right? There's some, I think sometimes there's some background work that we can do to kind of help ourselves out there. And yeah, if that makes sense. I got nerdy about yoga. I'm sorry, but that's kind of how I think about that.
Got it. So you started at the hell, but how did you personally ditch it?
Oh, yeah. I think I just had a really profound crisis of theodicy when I was an undergrad. Just like a really, really profound crisis of theodicy. Like I spent my entire last year in undergrad being like, how on earth can I think about God as loving if he like either, I mean, this Moody was very Calvinist. So Moody, like God's causing all the suffering. But even if you take like the non-Calvinist approach of like God allows the suffering, either way, it's horrible. It was just a profound crisis. I was just like, I cannot make sense of this and square this with a loving God. And I think what really ultimately kind of kicked it for me was, I think it's in, don't quote me on this, I want to say it's in The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. It might be in one of his other books, but I think it's The Four Loves, where he talks about like how, of course, all of our language about God is metaphorical, right? But he says, if our reasoning is so different, I'm going to butcher this, you can look it up, but he says, if our reasoning is so different from God's, that like our black could be God's white and God's black could be our white, like if the meaning is so completely different, then like we can mean nothing by calling God good. We might as well be worshiping a monster. And that's what on my second poetry album, I wrote this poem called Monster God, and that's what it's about. Like it's about like this idea that like sending people to hell is not love. And we know that intuitively, but people say it's love because God's ways are above our ways and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, or whatever the hell verse they want to use to justify that, right? But if it's so different, then what is even the point of using language to describe this, right? Like if love and hate, if love and hate, those definitions are so completely opposite, then we might as well not even talk about it, because there's no like linguistic overlap there, right? And I think that was one thing that really started to help me think about that was C.S. Lewis was writing about that, and just thinking through like, if hell is love, then what are we even doing? Like that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's not to say that we as people like have this like God's eye view on everything and we can understand everything, but like it is to say that like I believe that we can, in spite of the fact that all of our speech about God is metaphorical, I do believe that we can like use language to name things and use language to accomplish our ends. I don't think words mean nothing. Words can mean a lot of things. They call that like there's a range, right? Words can mean a lot of things, but they can't mean everything. And I don't think they mean nothing. Love can mean a lot of things, but I think we can pretty definitively say that love does not mean sending people to hell. There's a lot of different ways to show love, but that's not one of them. And so that's kind of how I would say that I started that. I think that's kind of how I started to make sense of that, is just knowing that like we actually can speak about these things.
Right. If I know you have a list of resources in the back of your book, but what do you is there a recommendation of a next resource you think would be helpful for people to like go from here? And I'm like, as far as
on
like,
hell or on sex?
Let's go with hell, because we're starting with hell now over here.
Hell's a harder one actually, because all they're really, I mean, what started it back when I was like deconstructing or whatever was like Rob Bell's Love Wins. And like, that's not even a good book. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, God bless him, but like, he just mangles Origin. Like it's not a particularly great text as far as like theological usefulness and accuracy. I think it's compelling for people to like start conversations, and love to start conversations. So I appreciate it for that reason. But people aren't really writing a whole lot on it at like the popular level. There's a lot. I mean, there's so much like academic work. And I'll say this, okay, right? There's not a lot of popular level work on it. Academically, one thing that I was both shocked and pleasantly surprised to find in grad school is that most like academics do not even remotely engage with the concept of hell. Like most people writing like theology textbooks and like teaching at the university level, like do not even They don't teach about hell. They don't write about hell. They don't even consider it as a possibility. Like, it's so hermeneutically untenable to them that they do not even discuss it. There's not even a concept of hell in Judaism, right? And like the concept of hell, you know, in New Testament is like people do not engage with it. And when I was reading like academic stuff in grad school, I was like, this is so comforting to me, because here's the thing. I think when you grow up in like evangelicalism is kind of like a snow globe, right? Or the Truman Show, right? You're inside of it and you think like this is all there is. And then you get out into the world and you're like, I'm a footnote in like the vast story of theology, right? My like evangelical fear of hell is a footnote in somebody else's like huge book about this. Like it really, I know it feels so much like you're in the middle of it and it's so, this is it and this is the whole world. And it's super duper not. And that's great. I find that so comforting. I find that so lovely. Yeah, if y'all find out about any works that are being written about this at the popular level, I would love to know about them, because I'd love to be able to like hand that to people. A lot of it is academic. And one thing that I feel really strongly about is translating academic work for popular level reading, so that stuff like that is not out of the hands for people who don't like spend their entire time reading grad level theology textbooks.
Well, maybe that's your next book.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I was actually going to say Love Wins by Rob Bell was my jumping off point on like actually just starting to think like, well, what if there is no hell? And that kind of started my thinking. Yes, it's a quick read. It's a short read. I recommend it as like a starting point into your own like work and mindset building. So yeah, on that note, there's so much to talk about theology wise, and I love like all the knowledge that you have, Emily. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on everything like purity culture and other stuff. We as a group really needed it. So again, thank you so much for your time. Love this conversation.
This is like one of my favorite things to do, by the way. I've done this a couple of times, and I'm sorry, my email inboxes, if you can imagine, are an absolute wreck. I have like 6 of them, and it just is a wreck. So I didn't respond to your email right away because I didn't see it. And then Emily texted me and I was like, I will do anything for you. But yes, this is like, I've done this a couple times before and I like absolutely love it. So thank y'all, because I think as an author, it's a little bit like, you know how bats echolocate? They like send out those electric signals and it bounces back off the walls, and that's how they figure out where to go. Like, that's how I experience myself as an author. I'm like, I want to hear it bounce back so I can understand what's happening and like where I need to go next and where the needs are. And so doing stuff like this is like such an amazing exercise for me, and like hearing my words bounce back at me and like seeing what's landing and what's useful for people and what's less useful. It's just like a very like meaningful and special experience to me. So like, thank you all.
Thank you again. And we have so much more that we would love to say, but time is short. But we will be looking out for your next book. I hope you continue to submit book ideas to whoever your publishers are.
It's on my list of things to do this year. I was a little busy like finishing grad school and getting married and buying a house. Like a lot of things happened, but it's on my list of things to do this year to sell the second book. I'm going to try really hard.
Can't wait.
It was
Thank you so much.
It was such a privilege, like getting to talk to you. Like, seriously.
Thank you.
Completely agree.
Thank you.
Thanks for making it happen, Emily.
I can do that.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Bye.
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 Everybody.